because sometimes the agenda for just transitions would vary from one jurisdiction to the other. But one thing that is common is it's about promoting social justice in the energy transition movement, ensuring we have a social inclusive decarbonization process, basically. And maybe just to add one more thing, which is that in Nigeria, of course, we have the Energy Transition Office, which indeed in 2022 published the Nigeria Energy Transition Plans, which I must say indeed details what Nigeria should be doing in terms of meeting local energy needs and balancing this with the climate action in accordance with our ambitions to be carbon neutral by 2060. I think I'll stop for now.
Thank you, sir. I think this is an apt introduction to the entire discourse we're about to have. It pretty much frames what our conversation is about. But just while you're still with us, what do you consider or what do you identify really as the challenges for just transition initiatives in Nigeria, specific to us?
Okay. Thank you very much for this. And but I would answer this by linking this in terms of the implications of just transitions, in terms of business and human rights movement. So business and human rights itself, very briefly, is considered a critique to CSR. And CSR, as we know, it's about businesses demonstrating responsibility for their impact, social, economic, and environmental impact in the society. While CSR appeared to have failed in terms of promoting voluntary operations or activities or commitment, business and human rights movement brought in, it injected accountability, basically. So with business and human rights, it considers the relationship between businesses, the business communities, and their impact, human rights impact, environmental impact in the society. So in terms of just transitions, the link essentially lies in ensuring that the business communities, even when we are talking about decarbonization, moving into the low carbon economy, in the course of doing this, they must as well demonstrate that they are carrying out the human rights due diligence, accounting for the social, economic, and environmental impacts of their operations. And this is why you would find companies in their business and human rights activities, you see them demonstrating commitment in terms of climate action, what their ambitions are in terms of the Paris Agreement. Now, to answer the question in terms of what the challenges appear to be, it's probably the same everywhere. It's a question of striking the balance. For instance, in Nigeria, there is the target to meet the energy needs in Nigeria. It is there. The gap is there. At the same time, we have commitment, in terms of the Paris Agreement to ensure that the economy is carbon neutral by 2060. How do we maintain the balance in terms of investment decisions, in terms of investment plans? It may not be easy, but the challenge is not peculiar to us. That is probably one thing to note. Everywhere in the world, even when businesses try to account, to identify in carrying out human rights due diligence, try to account for their environmental impact, there's always that fine line of how do we maintain that or find that odd balance in terms of our investment decisions while we try to maximize profit, at the same time consider the impact of what we are doing in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions leading to climate change. So to answer your question, the major challenge would be striking the balance. And maybe a peculiar problem with Nigeria would be maybe in terms of policy coherence and coordination. In Nigeria, yes, we have the Energy Transition Office, but there are so many things being done now in Nigeria. You'll be surprised that the PIA is actually an attempt towards just transitions. But
Mm-hmm.
to what extent, who is exactly coordinating all this in terms of what the business community should do or should not be doing to ensuring we have a socially inclusive decarbonization plan? I hope that
Thank you,
answers the
Doctor.
question.
Yes, it does. But then you also led me straight to what I had already considered asking you at the beginning of this, session. Do you have any final comments basically on legal and policy recommendations? You had just mentioned, something about the Nigerian policy system. You'd also talked about the PIA. Do you have any further comments, any recommendations with respect to our legal and policy
Well,
structure?
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Maybe the main thing I would mention would be that in terms of coordination, we probably need to do more. When we need to do better. Just before this webinar, going through the website of the Energy Transition Office, details there might not suggest that activities, if there are any, are being updated, or there is a proper coordination in terms of policies. Yes, all the right things have been said by the office. Anyone who can, who takes a look at the website would find that, yes, in terms of what we should be doing, in terms of policy framework, yes, we appear to have, a very good understanding. But in terms of implementation, what exactly are we doing? Who is coordinating what at what point? So we don't have this, the usual problem. We have all the laws, but nobody is implementing. So the recommendation is let's do more.
Let's do more, and of course, enforcement. Thank you, Dr. Najib. Thank you for your time and for such insightful recommendations. I think
My
we'll,
pleasure.
would would take Madam Ina Ali next. We'll be asking, Ina, how can, in your own opinion, how can businesses in Nigeria operationalize a people-centered energy transition framework to ensure historically marginalized communities are not only included, but actively benefit from the shift to renewable energy?
Uh, Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Nabila, thank you as well. Before I delve right into my own question, I just want to add a little bit on what Najim mentioned. So I am of the opinion, and I've written quite a few write-up about it, that Nigeria should actually focus on a just and equitable energy transition. Reason being is that we, as a country, or we in the global south, we are disproportionately affected with the mitigating causes of, the negative causes of climate change, the impact, flooding, global warming, and so many other things. Now, if we are to go about to commit to this 2060 net zero target that we've committed to under our ETP energy transition plan, I am one of those who advocate the use of gas as a transition fuel. Reason being is we have almost over actually 2 trillion cubic feet of gas untapped in Nigeria, which we can use to industrialize the country and get much needed revenue to drive other infrastructural and socio-economic growth in the country. Now, for us to do that, obviously, we need to ensure that our energy transition plan and those required to monitor it or to have oversight function on it, the Federal Ministry of Environment, the NCCC, that's the Nigerian Climate Change Council, should focus on. And coming back again to my question that Nabila just presented, I want to emphasize that obviously historically marginalized communities must be protected by all means. One is that a lot of the resources are tapped from those areas, and previously we've not had robust frameworks that protected those areas in terms of ensuring that there are minimal or no environmental hazards, the communities or the people there are protected. We've had the issues of the organic cleanup that the government is still trying to resolve, which is the last I checked, not much progress has been made. Some progress has been made, but much is left to be desired. Now, how do we shift in terms of focusing on renewable energy while protecting historic communities? Well, for starters, Nigeria has not renewable energy space, especially solar, up far north of the country. We've had a number of solar projects. I know the REA, the Rural Electrification Agency, is doing quite serving underserved communities and rural areas, as well as actually some built-up areas in terms of promoting these sustainable measures when it comes to energy use. Now, what can we do? I think on level, I would like to start with Climate Change Act, just the focus of my question. So the act was enacted in 2021, and its core objectives was just to focus on climate change policies and establish a framework for setting climate actions. Nigeria is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. There are about almost shy of 200 countries that have signed up to it. And for us to domesticate that agreement, we've had to enact the Climate Change Act, which led to the establishment of the NCCC and the policies and some of the decisions that we've taken so far as a country. Now, how can, again, these marginalized communities be included and actively benefit? On one hand, the PIA actually has come up with some frameworks to protect these communities. We have the host communities regulations in the between the upstream and the midstream sector. We've had that protecting the marginalized communities where players in those sectors must set up a fund to protect those areas and set up a trust actually to ensure that this area is not marginalized as previously encountered. We also have obligations that players again in those industries, especially in the upstream sector, to be able to ensure that whatever by the tail end of their business life, the environment and the communities are not affected disproportionately. We've also had gas flaring regulations highly protecting those environments, those areas, and ensuring that the quality of life and health hazards are minimalized, actually, because there are penalties that come up with that. With those actions. Historically, in Nigeria, in fact, my master's dissertation was on gas flaring and the need for Nigeria to ensure a sustainable shift because of the hazardous nature of gas flaring, the loss of significant revenue actually of gas flaring, and so many other uses in which gas can be rechanneled as opposed to it being flared. So we've come a long way in terms of protecting marginalized communities, but there's still much to be desired. There's the PIA, Climate Change Act, and so many other regulations and policies now have also come up with so many economic empowerment and job creation projects to ensure that these communities are protected or they are engaged. Stakeholder engagement is on the rise as compared to historical information where stakeholders within those communities are not carried along as much. We also have opportunities where persons within those communities can tap into this shift by being employed into, say, maybe renewable energy or solar panel assembly plants to pick up the skill and to gain an income as well. Also, those communities will be able to benefit from cheaper or almost free, affordable and reliable energy. One, because the players engaged in those marginalized communities or those communities with those resources would as part of their CSR or their obligations under the PIA example, would be able to benefit from, say, small-scale solar electrification within that. The REA, like I mentioned earlier, has been offering solar power solutions to upgrade communities or regions. Obviously, there's also the improved health outcome, which we've had a number of acts in the country, such as the NESRIA Act of 2007. NESRIA is National Environmental Standards and Regulations Enforcement Agency, so which supports clean energy to mitigate pollution. And the benefit of that is obviously less reliance on fossil fuel, or at least biomass, wood, charcoal. Under the ATP, actually, they also have the energy transition plan. They also have portions of it that encourage clean cooking in rural or underserved communities. And it's one of the things they've been mentioning. And again, tying back to this, I would like to also bring in the CNG, the whole buzzword that's been going on recently, compressed natural gas, in terms of allowing this is not even just historically marginalized communities, but you could consider them in this in terms of tapping the communities within those areas and Nigeria at large into utilizing clean energy. What else? I may have covered some or all. Do
Yes,
let
you
me know if
have.
I've not. I've not. Okay. All right. I think
Yes,
I
you
will
have.
stop for. Okay.
You've been
Thank you.
definitely exhaustive. I thank you first of all for the well thought out reply. I
Thank you.
totally align with your submission, especially the point on the common but differentiated principles that you spoke about just at the beginning. I think that basically
Mm,
encapsulates all of what we're trying to talk about here
mm,
today. Thank you. And then I'll be asking
mm,
you
mm,
a follow-up
mm,
question because you very
mhm.
exhaustively touched on
Okay.
various legislations,
Mm-hmm.
regulations. So I'll be
Mm-hmm.
asking, what
Mm-hmm.
specific regulatory and policy mechanisms are necessary to hold businesses accountable for human rights violations, and environmental sustainability in Nigeria? And how best do you think these frameworks can be effectively enforced? With Nigeria in particular, a lot of our issues stem from enforcement as opposed to maybe a lacuna in laws. So how best do you think
So,
these laws and frameworks can be enforced? Hi, Ina.
if I hear you correctly, you're asking what regulatory or policy mechanisms are necessary to.
You're breaking off, Ina. Hi, Ina. Oh, I think we may have lost Ina for a bit.
Everybody hear me, or am I the only one that's losing Nabila?
Okay, now I think we're losing you. Now we can hear you. Sorry, Nii, can you hear me? Mr. Debisi, can you hear
Yes, I
me?
can hear. Yes, I think she's a little bit glitchy.
Okay,
Maybe
so it's
she
on
can
Ina's
present
end.
without the video on, probably maybe
Okay,
there's a
Ina, if you can
network.
hear us, you can consider probably turning off your video so we can. Oh, I
Or she
think
can
unfortunately,
rejoin us. She can log in and log out and log in again. Yeah.
one
Yeah.
second. Oh, okay, she's still on.
Oh, okay.
But I think she may be having some connectivity issues. I don't know. We should possibly give her some time to get back with us, but then we can probably take the first question. Okay, I think Ina is back. Ina, can you hear us now?
Sorry, I lost you for a moment. Yes. Were you saying what specific regulatory and policy mechanisms are necessary to hold
Exactly.
businesses accountable?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
In general or in relates to human rights and
I think
environmental
we should
sustainability?
limit it to human rights and environmental sustainability within the Nigerian space.
Okay. Okay. There are a number of legislations actually and policies or regulations and guidelines that hold or ought to actually were created to hold businesses accountable relation to environmental sustainability and human rights. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, the Climate Change Act of 2021 established the National Council on Climate Change to oversee climate policies and ensure businesses contribute to environmental sustainability. Then we also have the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, EIA, of 92. It's quite an old act, but that framework actually mandates energy projects to undergo environmental impact assessments before they can proceed. Now, why do they need to do that? Just to evaluate and mitigate potential environmental and social impacts that might come up during the lifespan of the project. We also have the Electricity Act of 2023. It's fairly recent, and that in itself actually, because I am of the opinion that energy security is a human right. This new act actually expands regulatory oversight by allowing now state governments or subnationals to be able to participate in the whole electricity governance in terms of they can regulate and manage electricity within their own space. And we also have the NESRIA Act. NESRIA is National Environmental Standards and Regulations Enforcement Agency of 2007. And this, again, strengthens environmental accountability by ensuring that NESRIA, as an agency, regulates pollution, emissions, and industrial waste in the energy sector. Again, that's a human right issue because the downside of not managing or regulating these things obviously has serious also environmental consequence. So businesses that fail to meet that have issues of fine given to them, or they may face prosecution as the case might be. We've also had some case law, actually. I won't bore you into the details of it, but we've had case law where gas flaring was considered a violation to right to life and dignity. That for me is a very high standard set in terms of protecting human rights in Nigeria and protecting the environment as well. Also, as I previously mentioned, that Nigeria is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which we domesticated with the Climate Change Act. That again also is part of the regulatory, or rather the policy mechanisms that ensures human rights and environmental sustainability is there in Nigeria's energy transition plan. Nigeria also is as how do I put it? Nigeria also subscribes to the United Nations Framework United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's UNFCCC, and probably famously known as COP, Conference of Parties. We've had recently COP 29, which was last year. And we've had the year before COP 28, in which a number of landmark resolutions were made that focus on the protection of indigenous people, the protection of human rights and environmental, and the focus on ensuring that countries that subscribe to this are fully aligned in meeting the Paris Agreement target. The PIA is extremely important here, the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021. As I mentioned earlier, it contains sections that focus on decommissioning and abandonment of equipment or rigs within those areas, and ensuring there's environmental safety that come with that. We also have the host communities trust fund that protects those areas in which these energy companies use. So again, I think there are quite a number of them, but again, as a whole, I think these are the main ones that focus. Of course, there are secondary legislations in terms of policy guidelines, in terms of regulations that stem from the NUPRC, which is the oversight regulator for the upstream sector, Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission. And then also the NMDPRA, which is the Nigerian Midstream Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, for the midstream and downstream sector. They've come up with quite a number of guidelines and regulations that protect by extension, human rights and the environmental from a sustainability point of view. Lastly, actually, not lastly, we've had a number of policies that so this is what I mentioned is just in terms of regulatory compliance, but there is also corporate accountability, and we've had the Nigerian National Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Policy of 2015, which sets out very clear targets actually that businesses should meet in order to facilitate energy transition to a low carbon economy. Now, we also obviously have the national human rights legislation that protects individuals and communities. And then we also have the African Charter on Human Rights, on human and people rights, actually, which provides further legal ground for communities to demand environmental justice. Now, how do we ensure effective implementation? I think companies should, companies should be exposed to financial incentives such as tax breaks and grants for those that choose to involve themselves or get into the business of clean energy or environmental conservation. Stricter penalties should be imposed or must be imposed actually as a form of deterrence and for violators of pollution control laws or those that disregard carbon emission targets or land protection. So increasing fine or revoking operational licenses or holding directors or the corporate executives personally accountable, I think would ensure greater corporate responsibility. Importantly, actually, disclosure in terms of environmental impact and sustainability practice should be tighter enforced. So we have this concept of greenwashing. Greenwashing is basically it comes up when companies or corporations or even individuals sort of gloss over or over exaggerate on their sustainability practices just to come off as being green or carbon neutral or environmentally friendly. So in order to deter companies or corporations from this negative thing called greenwashing, I think implementation and enforcement has to be much tighter. So for Nigeria, like I mentioned earlier, and to stem on what Najim mentioned, to ensure a just and equitable transition in Nigeria, I think Nigeria ought to develop a just energy transition framework, which basically provides alternatives to those within that space in terms of retraining them or further training them in renewable energy sector, maybe in terms of retraining them or further training them in solar or wind or hydro industries. Maybe traditionally they're in the fossil fuel industries. I think generally that that is it for me. Of course, funding is very important. Everything mentioned here requires money, and money is almost always gotten from fossil fuel industries. So again, multinational or bilateral financing institutions, the likes of Africa Development Bank and World Bank, and actually local players as well, should focus on providing grants, bridging loans in order to ensure that companies tap into this to be able to meet the requirements that come up with sustainability. The government as well, while there's a political will, where there's concerted efforts by administrations or the government in Nigeria would go a long way. So far, we've seen some level of commitment. More needs to be done, but there so far from over the past maybe decade, we've seen a systematic shift in terms of focusing on sustainability practices, but vis-a-vis with Nigeria's energy demands, of course, and the required need for the revenue. Sustainability and renewable energy has been coming up in as much as fossil fuel investments as well. I think that's it from me. I hope I've covered some of or all that you require, but I think that's it from me on this particular question.
Yes, you have, Ina. I think your answer has been very interesting,
Thank you.
especially the portion on the precedents you talked about that you decided not to bore us with, although it may have
Which
been
one?
interesting. You talked about some cases that had, that's we glossed over. We could probably have heard a little bit on, but I thought it was interesting because even very recently too, I think we also heard about a case in Switzerland where a group of older Swiss women, you know, just won the first ever climate case victory in the European Court of Human Rights. Basically, they proved that as older women, they were worse hit by the effects of climate change, and it was so interesting. But I guess we can take that maybe a little later when we've run through all of what we've been talking about. So we have
Okay.
a final question for you.
Okay.
In your own opinion, how do you think, or how do you posit that corporate engagement in Nigeria's just transition balance, or in Nigeria's just transition, can possibly balance economic viability, social justice, and equitable energy access at the same time, while also reducing corporate harm? And in all of this, you're in the position to say, what role do you think law firms can play in facilitating this process through legal advocacy, regulatory compliance, and corporate accountability?
Okay, so from what I understand, there are two streams to your question, right? How can corporate engagement balance? I think you mentioned economic viability, social justice, and equitable energy access while reducing corporate harm. And the second part is you said, what can law firms do to facilitate compliance, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the first part of it, it's a tough one because companies by default they are created almost always to maximize profit returns, and sometimes at the risk of not finding this balance of social justice and equitable energy access in term in vis-a-vis economic viability. But for businesses to remain economically viable in Nigeria's energy transition, innovation is extremely important. In innovation, I mean coming up with indigenous solutions peculiar to Nigeria's climate or Nigeria's economic landscape, or generally the global south, as we have very similar indicators. By investing in clean technology and integrating sustainability in business model. I mean, integrating sustainability in business models is not as much a rocket science as it's seen to be. Reason being is just a matter of being mindful, being very conscious of the environment, reusing, refitting, maintaining, even maintenance of our, say, solar panels or using energy efficient bulbs. They're all part of sustainability. And in terms of minimizing the use of maybe using eco-friendly transportation network to deliver goods and services, or utilizing maybe webinars example as opposed to meeting in person, which has a higher energy use when maybe conducting meetings or functions that don't necessarily require human outcome. The Electricity Act has opened new opportunities for business to engage in terms of renewable energy generation, transmission, and distribution at state and federal level. That, for me, is a very typical example of opening up businesses to be economically viable while adhering to equitable energy access, and then obviously adhering to social justice, because energy and clean and affordable energy, as SDG Goal 7 indicates, is for me is a human right. The Climate Change Act it focuses on transitioning to cleaner energy sources, so businesses can tap into that to ensure long-term profitability by incorporating sustainable measures that would balance the profit side of it while maintaining social justice. What else? Okay, so minimizing corporate harm and strengthening corporate responsibility. So in terms of maybe waste management for companies that manufacture, having very robust and stringent waste management practices, especially maybe in companies that use hazardous environments. State governments need to do a lot more, actually, in terms of, especially in states where factories are quite prominent, to ensure that there are stricter environmental laws to protect the environment, and to also ensure that those areas are properly considered to prevent injustice to the people there, and to ensure that there is economic viability, obviously, for those that are there. Again, I mentioned, I think more than twice now, the PIA has come up with the Host Community Development Trust Fund, which requires oil and gas companies to allocate funds for community development. I think that's a very prime example of social justice, because it allows those companies to be economically viable, but also providing for the environment in which they operate in. The Net Zero Act obviously ensures that sustainability practices are adhered to. Yeah, I think that's it for that. Now, on the second part of your question is, so what are the roles law firm can play? There are quite a lot, actually, because I think law firms have a high responsibility when it comes to social justice, and setting the pace and tone in which economic viability ought to run, or ought to focus on. Legal advocacy is extremely important. A lot of times people are not aware of their rights. They're not aware of what they are supposed to do, not even just their rights. What are their responsibilities as citizens, as mindful citizens that ought to incorporate sustainability practices in their day-to-day lives. Law firms can engage in policy reform by attending public hearings, having stakeholder engagement, working with legislators, actually, on the state level and on the federal level as well. State House of Assembly, even as far as even local government authority as well, or the House of Representatives and the Senate in terms of getting them to draft or review stronger environmental protection laws, renewable energy, enhancing our current climate change, renewable energy laws, and of course, labor laws as well, because that will strengthen the whole social justice aspect of that question. Regulatory compliance is very important. So obviously, giving the right, correct advice to businesses that require it will help businesses navigate the often complex, actually, regulatory landscape of Nigeria. Corporate accountability as well, holding companies accountable for their practices. Now, another aspect of it is providing pro bono services to low or small micro or small scale businesses to be able to start from the get-go environmental or sustainability, to incorporate environmental or sustainability practices in their modes of operation. Also, actually, it might not even be highly relevant, but I think it goes a long way. It's also ensuring that there's a wide network of interns, right, or employees coming into the firm that will be trained on all these sustainability measures that we've been discussing so far. I think law firms have a high responsibility when it comes to ensuring that the country as a whole is aligned towards meeting the country, actually, not even companies, meeting its economic viability while also managing social justice, as well as ensuring that equitable energy access is for all. With that, actually, that's the end of my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Ina. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure we may have a few questions, but then we'll take it, I think, at the end of the entire session. I see people have been dropping in the comment box. So, Mr. Adebisi Sanda, I think we'll be having our conversation with you next. And your very first question, just maybe in your own words, help us unpack the concept of, just transition, generally with its business and human rights implications.
Thank you very much, Nabila. Thank you to the previous speakers and everyone that is here. I think the previous two speakers have done a lot of justice to this topic, and it just seems like I have to just repeat everything
No,
they've
I'm sure
said.
there's
So
something you can share with us.
yeah, so I'll pick from some of the things they've said. For example, I remember Dr. Nadim saying that the agenda for just transition daily, and that's actually very true because human rights also daily, they have right to life, right to against discrimination, freedom of association, and each of it actually means different things legally speaking. I can also recollect that Madam Ina said that she mentioned the PIA and she actually delved into that. And one thing I wanted to bring out there is that she said that the EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment Act, requires companies to conduct an environmental impact assessment before they, conduct a project. Now, the Petroleum Industry Act requires oil and gas companies to also conduct an environmental and social impact assessment before they decommission and abandon their project. So how did we get here? I think both speakers before me also mentioned the Paris Agreement, and I think that's the genesis of everything we are talking about here. The Paris Agreement, signatories to the Paris Agreement have committed rather to reduce global warming to or average temperature to just 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. And the main culprit for this, or the main culprit for climate change or global warming, is crude oil, coal, and gas, what is generally known as fossil fuels. And so we have to move away from fossil fuels into renewable or more renewable forms of energy. And this actually throws up a lot of social, issues as well as environmental issues as well as human rights issues. Aside from this, there's a lot of focus on technological development, and this is driving down the price of renewables. Is actually also um, bringing about new forms of energy, or you know, there's a lot of focus on developing energy outside the fossil fuel industry. So we have electronic vehicles, for example, which at some point may become cheaper than your regular diesel or petrol engine. You also have things like your um, electronic vehicles still, which at the end of the day may require less maintenance than your typical and then you also have consumer preferences. I'm sure a lot of people here, from the last year we've been dealing with band A, band B, band C. I mean, a lot of consumers are shifting their orientation from connecting to the grid to just having solar on their roof. And once the sun is shining, they are happy. They have light in their, houses. So because of all of this, there's going to be less focus on the fossil industry, in the medium to long term. And what this means that a whole industry that generates employment, that gives countries like Nigeria the major source of their foreign exchange, as well as you know generate a lot of economic activities in the communities where they sit, will be impacted by the transition, because once this fossil fuel developers don't see the demand anymore, they may be forced to start closing down their facilities. And once that happens, human or employees are going to be affected, countries are going to be affected. Countries like Nigeria is going to be affected economically and developmentally. So the question is, how do we ensure that this transition doesn't impact human or social or the environment adversely? And as Madam Ali mentioned earlier, laws like the PIA, have been enacted to sort of soften, the impact of some of these, transition issues. And again, just to rehash, Dr. James says the agenda for just transition varies. So this is just one agenda. There are probably, several other agendas depending on which side you are looking at it from. So the PIA says that before you decommission, you should have a plan. You should do an ASIA and you should give adequate notice of that decommissioning, and then you must meaningfully engage with communities, meaningfully engage with labor unions, meaningfully engage with government. And then you also think about having alternative investments to replace whatever economic activities, that your oil and gas development activity, is going to, when your is going to replace, essentially. And then for workers who are losing their jobs, or workers who cannot find alternatives, because it's an industry-wide thing. So once fossil fuel goes, it's not like an engineer someone that's trained to be a petroleum engineer and is expecting that to give himself or herself a livelihood for the next 40 years, can find he or herself after 20 years having no practical use for, reservoir skills, because, the industry has sort of gone down. So those are kind of issues if you look at how do you retrain this kind of employees? How do you, redeploy their expertise into other areas? And some countries have, slightly different approaches. For example, in China, there's a fund or a compensation fund for unemployed coal workers and steel workers, for example. So those are the kind of issues I think, you know, or at least one aspect of the just transition question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sander, for your answer. Would be in your own opinion, how do you think businesses can ensure respect and protect human rights, especially for vulnerable communities? How can local communities be effectively engaged, involved, and represented in the energy transition process in Nigeria? Like practically, what have you seen and what do you think that we can do to actually safeguard this process?
Okay. I mean, so you've mentioned a number of things: vulnerable communities, respect and protection of human rights, you know, engagement of community, as well as seems to have forgotten. But anyway, I will try as much as possible to address all of this. I think Madam Ina mentioned, the Ogoni cleanup. The Ogoni problem has been a problem that has been in existence since the 90s or even the 80s. And, here we are in 2025 and government is still having, to engage with the community to start production in Ogoni. I mean, we're all familiar with the story of Kensarua, how it was essentially killed by the military government and which threw up a lot of human rights implications and sanctions on Nigeria as well as um, monetary compensation from Shell, which was the company involved in that. So businesses need to think about the protection of human rights from this kind of incidences that have happened in the past. I mean, when we all buy our phone, I'm sure everybody here looks at their as a screen protector, popularly called screen protector, so that whenever your phone falls down, it doesn't break. And some people also have a cover, to cover the back of their phone. So that's the way to think about human rights. As a business, you are expected to respect human rights. And in doing so, you have to examine what sort of human rights your business can affect and then put in mitigation measures to ensure that your business doesn't affect those human rights. It's the analogy of the screen protector. You have to take a precaution to ensure that your screen doesn't break. You have to a business has to take precautions to ensure that their business doesn't adversely affect human rights. And how do businesses go about doing this? Number one, you have to realize that your business goes beyond what goes on in your office. But you have to think about it from your office, your operational sites, your the users of your product, the communities, your entire value chain. Because even aside from your own operational factories, you have people that supply you raw materials, they have your distributors, they have franchisees. So a business has, a whole universe of stakeholders, and human rights can be impacted anywhere within this value chain. So as a business, you have to think of it, are you causing human rights violations? Are you contributing, to human rights violations? Or is human rights violations being linked, to your business operations? And look at the oil and gas industry, for example. A lot of issues that will come up in terms of human rights may have to do with the environment, may have to do with maybe collective bargaining, um, discrimination and equality, because the industry is kind of male dominated, given that, probably from education or a lot of engineers are just men. And as a result, you have to consciously think about how that affects the women in your workforce. Are they being harassed in the office? Are they being harassed at the sites, at the production sites, and and things like that? And as I said earlier, some of these impacts don't happen in the office. They may happen at sites, yeah, or they may happen um, in other people's businesses that contribute to your business. So you have suppliers, and one popular example, which may not be related to energy, is there's a region in China where the forced labor is being used on a large scale. I think they call the particular tribe the Uyghurs or the Uyghur minority in China, who are being forced, to produce apparel, cotton, and the rest of that. The question here is that as a business, do you condone that kind of behavior within your supply chain? It doesn't happen on your own facility, but it happens, you know, elsewhere. How do you leverage, your contracts? How do you leverage your internal policies to prevent such from happening? And then you have been linked to business. So some businesses use, and again, they have a very practical example. Some businesses use military and paramilitary forces for security. And you know that these forces sometimes, they can go on a frolic of their own. For example, yesterday, there's, reports about officers of the military in Kenya here going to a business to harass and to, harass innocent citizens going about their business. So these are the kind of things you look at. How do you use, your policies? How do you use, ensure that your business does not create that kind of impact on people's human rights? I haven't done that. Um, so again, I've mentioned it can be your workers involved. It can be workers within your value chain, whether your suppliers, whether your distributors, whether your franchisees. And then you can also look at it from the angle of, people that consume your business. And there are practical examples to that, especially, maybe not in the energy space, but there are practical examples as to, using your phone or social media and how that affects your privacy. So your impact as a business or impact on human rights as a business goes beyond, just you, and you have to think about it that way. What makes communities vulnerable? One thing that makes communities vulnerable, and I think you mentioned that there was a case where some elderly women, sued the Swiss government and, got, yeah, because all around the world, women, children, and the elderly are generally recognized as, vulnerable communities. But there might be other things that make a particular person vulnerable in terms of your business. Might be that, for example, you might be using a lot of migrant workers in your business. That makes the fact that they are not in their country makes them vulnerable to, different types of. So those are the ways to think about vulnerable communities, and there might be context which make people vulnerable, or which makes people exposed to human rights impact. And those contexts, I think I've highlighted some of it before. Maybe, things like you have a lot of it's a male-dominated industry. There's no balance in them. So you have to think of how that affects, those vulnerable people. Um, Sorry, I think I've sort of lost track of, the question.
Oh no, you're on track and actually leading straight to our very next question for you.
Yeah.
I think you've very exhaustively, shared with us how you think businesses can respect, and protect human rights, taking vulnerable communities particularly into consideration. But now I would like to or understand how, or rather what role businesses can play in supporting energy transition as a whole and the reduction of, greenhouse emissions.
This is a very interesting question. So I work in ARM Harris, Infrastructure Investment Limited, and we have businesses which we support. Like we support a lot of mini grids and interconnected mini grids in the north. Madam Ina mentioned this, and I think financing the clean energy is one important aspect, of business support to the transition effort. Aside from, the mini grid projects we have in the north, we also have a fund, which we are presently raising, which is specifically themed towards and it's called Clean and Transition, Fund. So it's exclusively for clean, and transition. So whatever is clean energy, whatever is transition energy, or whatever sort of has some climate mitigation and adaptation angle to it is what we are permitted to invest in. So it starts with the finance. We need a lot of businesses to start thinking, or a lot of financial institutions start thinking in this light, how to support, the transition or movement away from fossil fuel to cleaner sorts of energy. And then another thing which um, we need to focus on. Okay, so before joining AIM, I used to work in a company called the Wando, and I so again, this is one of the things that is prevalent in the oil and gas industry. To different extents, it splits, it changes from time to time. But a lot of oil and gas companies are setting up subsidiaries or separate businesses that focus on just renewable, you know. And this is how some of the oil and gas companies are supporting, this transition. For example, the business I mentioned earlier, a couple of years ago, launched electronic vehicles, for use of public transportation in Lagos State. That has never been done before anywhere in the country. And, that was a learning experience. They brought in two buses, just to see how this thing works. What sort of energy there is to charge those buses. A lot of other challenges, behind that kind of initiative. But at least, they are they are creating some blueprints, for the movement away from fossil fuels. And then you have, there's another company right here in Lagos that changed all the windows in the headquarters into solar panels. So those might look like grand gestures, they might look, but companies in Nigeria are beginning to, sort of wake up to the reality that at some point we would need um, to utilize cleaner energy and move away from fossil fuels. And as they say, um, prevent catastrophic climate events from happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sander. I think you've basically hit the nail on the head. We have a firm understanding of the role of businesses with respect to reduction of greenhouse gases. And thank you for all the, practical examples that you have shared, during the course of your role at your current workplace. Thank you very much. I know we have a couple of questions, and I think some answers have already been provided in the chat box. But then I think there's there's probably one outstanding question or a number of them.
Yeah, we have one
The
for
first,
Dr. Jim and one for Miss Ina.
okay, so I think I'll take the one first for Mr. Najim. Okay, I think the first one he has responded to it. Then the second one, my question draws from the CSR framework, specifically whether the framework can be used by businesses and corporations to drive energy transition in Nigeria, bearing in mind the voluntary nature and approach to CSR. If yes, what strategies can be employed to ensure enforcement or compliance by businesses and corporations?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, thank you. That's a very excellent question. I'll just, try and summarize what my understanding is and, be as brief as possible. So my book on corporate social responsibility and law in Nigeria, in Africa, one thing, if there's any contribution of that book, is to the effect that our conception of corporate social responsibility generally in Nigeria, if not in Africa, we probably need to do better. And that is taking CSR as simply some charity, corporate charity. It's not going to get us anywhere. So to answer the question in terms of what CSR framework can do, maybe it can be employed to drive just transitions, in my view. And it's not going to work if it's essentially on a voluntary basis. And like I said earlier in my introduction, this is exactly the reason why the business and human rights movement came into the picture, to really inject. I'm sure other speakers must have mentioned it. The origins of business and human rights around the world, the Ogoni case, is actually one of the trigger points usually mentioned. It is because you see companies, multinationals, churning out, publishing sustainability reports, CSR reports, saying, having these rosy statements about what they have been doing. Whereas in terms of, the real management of the impacts of the operations, it's probably nothing to write home about. So in terms, to answer the question, CSR framework, definitely if it's going to help, it's not going to be at the same level of conception, which is popular right now. I commend that book, Corporate Social Responsibility and Law in Africa, published by Routledge. I think that might be useful for an appropriate framework. And very quickly, I will say this. other speakers, we've talked about specific acts, what companies are doing in their value chain, in their supply chains, what they can do to respect human rights. Like I said, there's one problem, however, it is called corporate capture. So the question is, what should these businesses be doing? How can they really ensure? What framework is there to really drive just transitions? And by the just transitions, how to really promote social justice, a socially inclusive, decarbonization where the interests being considered is not just the interest of local communities, as the PIA tries to address. We're talking about the interest of the employees, of companies trying to transition as well. The so many other stakeholder interest. How do we exactly ensure that no one is truly left behind? My answer is, let's go back to human rights due diligence. The world has gone beyond voluntary human rights due diligence. Now you find in jurisdictions around the world, in fact, the latest law now, at the level of the EU, is called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. What that directive, what that regulation is doing is to ensure now that is a very overarching, comprehensive, mandatory due diligence regime for business communities, not only on themselves, but their partners, their affiliates in their value chain, to ensure that whatever they seek to do, even within just transitions framework, that the interests of stakeholders, they ensure that human rights, environmental rights, are duly safeguarded. So, to summarize, what will work is a very effective, mandatory human rights due diligence framework, which we need to find a way to introduce into our laws in Nigeria. I'm aware there is an attempt at the level of the AU with the business and human rights policy. We really don't know where that is right now. But if only the AU can can spearhead, take the leading role as the EU has done, maybe countries, specific jurisdictions in Africa like Nigeria would also be able to draw, from such policy framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Najim. Thank you for your answer. I think due to time constraints, we will just take one last question for Ina and then give Mr. Sander just maybe a minute or two to give his final comments on today's discourse. So Ina, given the tax incentives and other benefits provided to companies, which you have, of course, explained earlier, how can we ensure that energy companies and projects do not replicate or even worsen past injustices historically linked to fossil fuel industries, particularly in countries like Nigeria, where a just and equitable transition may not be supported by strong political will?
Okay, it's actually a very wide question, but how do we ensure? I think the no-brainer answer to that is, before I go into some specific, is to ensure that we've got a robust legislation in place that is continuously amended to fit current realities that were not envisaged when it was initially enacted. Secondary legislation, we already have the PIA, we have the Climate Change Act, we have the NESRIA, we have the EIA, we have quite a few. We have the Local Content Act as well. Now it's to prevent past injustice, as was the case of the Ogoni environmental mess that happened some decades ago. Now we've got stricter legislation. There's more global and local awareness as what is right and what is not. As we mentioned earlier, the PIA has one of the protection mechanisms to prevent this past injustice is the host communities development trust fund. Now, why do we even have that? We have that to protect in the event that something like the injustice in the past, in situations where it does happen, the government has the fund to be able to manage it. But before it even gets to the situation where this even arises, there are stricter laws and penalties and personal responsibilities of the corporate executives involved in it. Now, another thing is advocacy. Advocacy is extremely powerful to counter these injustices. In the age of social media, previously we didn't have that when those historical injustices were documented. We just had newspapers, the radio, and journals here and there to document and account for it. Now we've got social media like X, which at the speed of a second or two, with live, live video or photos and evidence can be put out there to ensure that these corporations take accountability or are very cautious to engage in any environmental injustice or any injustice that is historically linked to fossil fuel. Community engagement is extremely important. Stakeholder management is very important. And we have seen so far that companies, even those that were historically involved in those injustices before, are now a bit more proactive in ensuring local communities are being managed and carried along much better than how they did in the past. I think just general global awareness and the role of the UN and other NGOs and collectives like Global Alliance and the Bezos Fund and so many other things, the COP as well. They've have highlighted and ensured that even actually sustainability, climate change actors or advocates actually have contributed immensely to putting these companies on their toes to ensure there is no missteps happening. To some extent, I would like to also bring in the indicators of countries in terms of GDP, right, which is an indicator of how a country is doing. There's also the Human Development Index and GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator as well, index. Using that as well from a national level would put countries on their toes to ensure that they contribute their own quota or they contribute their own role in ensuring that these historical injustices are not happening again. Obviously, stronger legal recourse and enforcement, promoting renewable energy as well, vis-a-vis the fossil fuel, is very important here. I think those are the notes that I've jotted down. I don't know if I've answered the question fully, or is there anything that I might have not covered? I think that's it really.
Yes, it is. There's no outstanding section. Thank you very much, Ina.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll take Mr. Sander before we close totally. Just a few, comments to wrap up.
Okay. Again, thanks to the previous two speakers and yourself and everybody that is here. But I mean, again, we need to ask ourselves, these, basic and fundamental questions. In this transition to renewables or to cleaner forms of energy, are we going to perpetuate the same injustices that happened with the fossil fuel industry? We need to ask ourselves these questions. Our suppliers in China or wherever, are we ensuring that the solar panels that are being imported under good conditions, or the workers that produce the battery or the storage or the inverter did so in very humane circumstances. The owners of the new, energy resources that we are going to be developing, is there gender balance? Those are the kind of questions I think we need to ask ourselves, both as industries and as individual. And as Dr. Najim Amodi mentioned, human rights due diligence is a wake-up call for a lot of companies. You need to, I mean, here in ARMI, for example, we go to some of these mini grid sites multiple times a year, and it will amaze you the kind of issues that just a site visit, just talking with the security guard, at those places can elicit. So those are the kind of things we need to pay particular attention to as a business in ensuring a just transition that respects human rights. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sander, for the food for thought. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, of course, we have come to the end, or rather, as we come to the end of this insightful session on, just energy transition and its implications on business and human rights. I want to first of all sincerely thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their expertise, their time, and your perspectives. Your contributions have deepened our understanding of these opportunities and the challenges in transitioning. Generally, this discourse as a whole, your insight has deepened our understanding of it. And then from today's conversation or from today's discussion, it's clear that achieving a just energy transition requires balancing economic, environmental, social considerations. We also understand that businesses must navigate policy shifts, adapt sustainable practices, and ensure that no community is left behind. At the same time, we also, understand that human rights must remain at the center of energy policies and corporate strategy. So there's a sweet nexus somewhere where everything has to be balanced, and then your conversations and your perspective has thrown more light on the interplay between all these different variables. And then to our audience, we thank you for your engagement and your thoughtful participation. We encourage each of us here to continue to have these important conversations at home, at our workplaces, beyond this room, just so we can continue to drive meaningful action in our respective spheres and sectors in life. So with that, I officially close this discussion and this session. Thank you all once again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Everyone,
Thank
thank you,
you, everyone.
moderator.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.